The roar of New York City, once a symphony of ambition and success for Arthur Sterling, had transformed into a dissonant chorus of ruin. At 45, Arthur was the epitome of the American dream, a real estate mogul with an empire stretching from Manhattan skyscrapers to luxury resorts in Miami. His life was a tapestry of private jets, exclusive dinners, and the admiration or envy of all who crossed his path. But, like a house of cards built on quicksand, everything collapsed in a single night. The global financial crisis, which many economists had predicted but few truly believed would touch him, arrived with the force of a tsunami. Arthur, always a high-stakes gambler, had leveraged too much, relying on optimistic projections and ignoring the warning signs. His investments, once considered genius, became toxic assets. The news came through a cold, impersonal call from his board of directors at 3 a.m., while he slept in his 5,000-square-foot penthouse overlooking Central Park. "Mr. Sterling, the board has voted. The company is insolvent. Your personal assets will be liquidated to cover the debts." The phone slipped from his hands, the sound of plastic against marble echoing in the oppressive silence of the apartment. Moonlight bathed the room, revealing the opulence that was now merely a ghost of his past. He walked to the window, watching the city lights that seemed to mock his downfall. That empire, built with decades of relentless work, personal sacrifices, and insatiable ambition, had dissolved like smoke. His wife, Victoria, a woman he loved more for the image she projected than for the person she truly was, had already left months ago, taking with her what remained of his family and the little warmth that had been in his home. His children, distant and accustomed to a life of privilege, barely knew him. The next day, newspapers screamed sensational headlines: "The Sterling Empire crumbles. From top to bottom, the fall of Arthur Sterling." Images of his face, once synonymous with power, were now accompanied by articles that painted him as an arrogant fool. His phones stopped ringing. Friends, business partners, sycophants, all vanished as if they had never existed. The mansion in Greenwich, the yacht in the Mediterranean, the vintage car collection, everything was seized, auctioned, swallowed by the maelstrom of bankruptcy. He found himself in a small rented apartment, with only a few boxes of belongings and the clothes on his back. The mirror reflected a man he barely recognized. Empty eyes, slumped shoulders, the shadow of a man who was once Arthur Sterling. The fall was not just financial, it was an annihilation of his identity, a devastating blow to his soul. He was naked, stripped of everything that defined his existence, confronted with the emptiness of a life built on false pillars. The question that haunted him was, who was Arthur Sterling without his money, his now non-existent empire? The days following Arthur's fall were a blur of silence and solitude. The rented apartment, a small, impersonal space on the Lower East Side, was a stark contrast to the grandeur of his former penthouse. The thin walls allowed him to hear the vibrant life of the city outside. Laughter, music, honking horns, a constant reminder of the world he had lost. He felt like a castaway on a deserted island, watching ships pass in the distance, unable to call for help. His phone, once a portal to a universe of business and contacts, now remained silent. The few times it rang, it was relentless bill collectors or unknown numbers he lacked the courage to answer. His friends, those he thought were loyal, evaporated. Cancelled dinners, unanswered messages, averted gazes at rare public appearances. "That's what happens when you have nothing left to offer," he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse from disuse. His reputation, once impeccable, was in tatters, stained by newspaper articles and malicious gossip that painted him as a greedy villain or a naive fool. The mirror became his enemy. Each morning, he saw an aged man, with deep dark circles under his eyes and a lost gaze. That was not the Arthur Sterling he knew. His sense of worth, once intrinsically linked to his financial success and the power he wielded, had vanished. He was a zero, a nobody. Shame was a heavy burden, crushing him under its weight. He spent hours staring at the ceiling, reliving every wrong decision, every ignored warning, every lost opportunity. Regret was a slow poison, corroding his soul. One afternoon, As he tried to distract himself with an old book he found in a box, the doorbell rang. It was an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, with a plate of cookies. "I saw you moved in. Thought you might be hungry," she said with a kind smile. Arthur, accustomed to being served by a staff of employees, felt a lump in his throat. He tried to refuse, but her insistence was genuine. As he ate the cookies, the first decent food in days, he felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in a long time, human warmth. But the feeling was fleeting. The shame of his situation overwhelmed him again. He thanked her hastily and closed the door, returning to his self-imposed prison. He knew he needed to do something, but the paralysis was complete. The idea of starting over, of facing the world without his shield of wealth and power, was terrifying. He felt small, insignificant. Each day, the darkness seemed to deepen, threatening to swallow him whole. Solitude was not just the absence of people, it was the absence of himself. The Arthur Sterling he knew had died with his empire, and what remained was just an empty shell, adrift in a sea of despair. The question was no longer who he was without his money, but if he was still anyone at all. Weeks bled into months, each day a monotonous cycle of self-pity and despair. Arthur's small apartment became his sanctuary and his prison. He rarely ventured out, and when he did, it was usually to the local diner for a cheap meal, where he'd sit in a booth, hidden behind a newspaper, trying to avoid recognition. It was during one of these solitary excursions that fate, in its peculiar way, intervened. He was nursing a lukewarm coffee, staring blankly at the street outside, when an elderly man slid into the opposite side of his booth. The man had kind, crinkled eyes and a neatly trimmed white beard. He wore a simple worn tweed jacket and carried a well-thumbed book. "Mind if I join you, son? All the other tables are taken," the man said, his voice a gentle rumble. Arthur, startled, mumbled a reluctant assent. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders," the stranger observed, his gaze surprisingly perceptive. Arthur bristled, ready to snap back, but something in the man's eyes disarmed him. "I lost everything," Arthur confessed, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "My business, my reputation, my purpose." The old man nodded slowly. "Ah, purpose. A tricky thing, isn't it? Most people confuse it with possessions, or power, or even people." He took a sip of his tea. "My name is Elias, and I've seen a few falls in my time. Some of my own, some of others." Arthur, against his better judgment, found himself listening. Elias spoke of resilience, not as a trait one is born with, but as a muscle developed through hardship. "You built an empire once, didn't you?" Elias asked. Arthur nodded, a flicker of his old pride surfacing. "Then you know how to build. The materials might be different this time, the blueprints might be unfamiliar, but the fundamental skill remains. The question is, what will you build now? And for whom?" Elias didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. Instead, he challenged Arthur's core beliefs. "You defined yourself by what you had, Arthur, not by who you were. That's why the fall was so devastating. It wasn't just a loss of assets, it was a loss of self. But perhaps that's a gift in disguise. A chance to discover the real Arthur Sterling, unburdened by the expectations of wealth." Their conversation lasted for hours. Elias spoke of humility, of finding strength in vulnerability, and of the profound difference between success and significance. "Success is often measured by what you accumulate," Elias concluded, his eyes twinkling. "Significance, however, is measured by what you contribute, by the lives you touch. Which one do you truly seek?" As Elias rose to leave, he placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "The path forward isn't about regaining what you lost. It's about finding something far more valuable." He left Arthur with a profound sense of unease, but also a tiny spark of curiosity. Elias hadn't offered comfort, but a challenge that, for for the first time in months, stirred something other than despair within Arthur's hollowed-out soul. Elias's words lingered in Arthur's mind like an unwelcome echo, stirring a tempest within him. The tiny spark of curiosity Elias had ignited was quickly overshadowed by a resurgence of the familiar demons: depression, regret, and anger. He found himself pacing the cramped apartment, Elias's questions, "What will you build now? And for whom?" bouncing off the walls, mocking his current state of helplessness. He wanted to dismiss the old man's advice as naive platitudes, the ramblings of someone who couldn't possibly understand the magnitude of his loss. "Easy for him to say," Arthur muttered to the empty room, kicking at a loose floorboard. "He hasn't lost everything. He hasn't been publicly humiliated, stripped bare of his identity." The anger was a hot, bitter taste in his mouth. Anger at the market, at his former partners, at Victoria, at the world, but most intensely at himself. How could he have been so blind, so arrogant? The regret was a constant gnawing, a replay of every missed sign, every ignored warning. He saw himself in the boardroom, dismissing cautious advisers with a wave of his hand, convinced of his own infallibility. Sleep offered little respite. His nights were plagued by vivid dreams of his former life, the gleaming towers, the roar of applause at galas, the effortless power he once wielded. Then, the dreams would shift, morphing into nightmares of falling, endless and terrifying, waking him in a cold sweat. During the day, he'd stare at the phone, contemplating calling Elias, then recoiling. What would he say? That he was too weak, too broken to even begin to consider Elias's challenge? The thought of admitting his vulnerability, even to a stranger, was unbearable. One particularly dark afternoon, the weight of his thoughts became unbearable. He found himself standing by the window, looking down at the bustling street below. The urge to simply disappear, to cease to exist, was a chilling whisper in his ear. He closed his eyes, picturing the faces of his children, distant as they were. Even in his darkest hour, a faint sense of responsibility, a flicker of paternal love, held him back from the precipice of utter despair. It was a fragile thread, but it was there. He remembered Elias's question, "Which one do you truly seek? Success or significance?" The question pricked at his conscience. All his life, he had chased success, defined by numbers and accolades. But what had it truly brought him? A hollow victory, ultimately. The idea of significance, of contributing something beyond personal gain, felt alien, almost absurd, yet it resonated with a part of him he hadn't known existed. The inner battle raged on, a brutal tug-of-war between the Arthur Sterling who clung to his past glory and the nascent, frightened Arthur who was being forced to confront a new, terrifying reality. He wasn't ready to embrace Elias's philosophy, but he also couldn't entirely shake it off. The seed had been planted, and even amidst the thorns of his despair, it stubbornly refused to die. The internal struggle was relentless, a cacophony of self-recrimination and fleeting hope. Arthur spent days wrestling with Elias's words, the idea of significance battling against the ingrained pursuit of success. One morning, a particularly vivid nightmare of his financial collapse left him gasping for air, drenched in sweat. He looked around his meager apartment, the stark reality of his situation hitting him with renewed force. He couldn't stay like this. He had to do something, anything, to break the cycle. He started small. The first step was simply leaving the apartment for more than a quick diner run. He walked aimlessly through the city, observing the lives around him. He saw people working, laughing, struggling, living. It was a world he had once dominated from a distance. Now he was just another face in the crowd. The anonymity was both terrifying and liberating. He found himself drawn to a small community garden, a vibrant oasis amidst the concrete jungle. He watched an elderly woman meticulously tending to her plot, her hands gnarled but gentle. He felt a strange pull, a desire to connect with something real, something growing. His next small step was even more daunting: finding a job. The thought of applying for anything less than a CEO position was humiliating. He, Arthur Sterling, reduced to entry-level work? Yet, the hunger in his stomach was a powerful motivator. He walked into a small, bustling coffee shop, the aroma of roasted beans filling the air. The owner, a no-nonsense woman named Maria, looked him up and down. His expensive, albeit worn, suit and polished shoes were out of place. "What can I do for you?" she asked, her arms crossed. I'm looking for work," Arthur stammered, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He expected a laugh, a dismissal. Instead, Maria simply pointed to a stack of dirty dishes. "Can you wash those?" Arthur, who hadn't washed a dish in decades, hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, a memory of Elias's words, "The materials might be different this time," flashed through his mind. "Yes," he said, his voice gaining a surprising firmness. "Yes, I can." His first few days were a blur of aching muscles, scalding water, and the unfamiliar rhythm of manual labor. He made mistakes, dropped trays, and felt the sting of Maria's sharp corrections. But he also felt something else, a strange sense of accomplishment. He was earning his keep, contributing. One afternoon, a customer, a young artist, complimented him on the perfectly frothed milk in her latte. "This is excellent," she smiled. "Thank you." A simple compliment, yet it resonated with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about the money, or the power, or the grand gestures. It was about a small, genuine connection, a moment of positive impact. He was still Arthur Sterling, but he was also something new. A barista, a server, a person contributing in a small, tangible way. The journey was excruciatingly slow, filled with moments of doubt and self-loathing, but with each cup of coffee served, each table wiped, he was taking small, deliberate steps away from the abyss and towards an unknown, yet strangely hopeful future. Life in the coffee shop, though humbling, had begun to carve a new routine for Arthur. He was no longer the invisible man, but a familiar face, known for his surprisingly good lattes and quiet efficiency. Yet, the past, like a persistent shadow, refused to stay buried. One crisp autumn morning, as he wiped down tables, the bell above the door chimed, announcing a new customer. Arthur looked up, and his breath hitched. Standing there, ordering a black coffee, was David Chen, a former junior partner whose small investment firm Arthur had ruthlessly acquired years ago, leaving Chen's dreams in ruins. David, now older, with lines of stress etched around his eyes, didn't immediately recognize the man behind the counter. Arthur, however, remembered every detail of their last encounter: David's desperate pleas, his own cold dismissal. A wave of nausea washed over him. He could pretend not to notice, let Maria handle the order. But Elias's words, about facing vulnerability, echoed in his mind. This was a test, a chance to confront the ghosts of his past. With a trembling hand, Arthur prepared David's coffee. As he placed it on the counter, David finally looked up. His eyes, initially scanning for the barista, widened in disbelief. "Arthur," he stammered, his voice a mixture of shock and something akin to resentment. The air in the small coffee shop grew thick with unspoken history. Arthur braced himself for the inevitable outburst, the accusations he knew he deserved. "David," Arthur managed, his voice raspy. "It's been a long time." He expected anger, a demand for an explanation. Instead, David's expression softened, replaced by a weary sadness. "I heard about your fall," David said quietly, his gaze sweeping over Arthur's simple uniform. "Never thought I'd see you like this." "Neither did I," Arthur admitted, looking away. I owe you an apology, David, for what I did to your firm, for how I treated you. I was a different man then, blinded by ambition." The words, though difficult, felt like a release. A heavy weight lifted from his chest. David stared at him, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "An apology? From Arthur Sterling?" He chuckled, a humorless sound. I never thought I'd live to see the day." They talked for a long time, the coffee growing cold between them. Arthur didn't make excuses. He simply listened, absorbing David's pain, the years of struggle that followed the acquisition. He learned that David had eventually rebuilt his life, starting a small consulting business focused on ethical investments. There was no grand reconciliation, no immediate forgiveness. But as David left, he paused at the door. "It takes courage to admit your mistakes, Arthur," he said, a hint of respect in his voice. Maybe you're not that different after all. Just clearer." Arthur watched him go, a profound sense of humility washing over him. The encounter was painful, but it was also a crucial step towards healing, a stark reminder that true wealth was not in what he accumulated, but in the integrity he had so carelessly discarded. The encounter with David Chen had been a crucible, burning away more layers of Arthur's old self. The shame was still there, a dull ache, but it was now accompanied by a nascent sense of clarity. Elias's words about significance began to resonate more deeply. He realized that his relentless pursuit of wealth had not only cost him his empire but had also left a trail of collateral damage, people like David whose lives he had carelessly impacted. The coffee shop, once a temporary refuge, now felt too small for the burgeoning ideas within him. He started spending his days off at the public library, devouring books on sustainable development, social entrepreneurship, and ethical business practices. The world he had once navigated with cutthroat efficiency now presented itself with new complexities and opportunities for genuine contribution. He saw how his old industry, real estate, could be a force for good, not just profit. He began sketching designs, not for towering skyscrapers that symbolized personal power, but for affordable, energy-efficient housing, community centers, and urban green spaces. One evening, he sought out Elias again, finding him in the same diner, nursing a cup of herbal tea. Arthur, no longer bristling with defensiveness, poured out his thoughts, his newfound passion evident in his animated gestures. "I've been thinking about what you said, Elias. About significance. I want to build again, but not just for myself. I want to build something that matters, something that helps people, that leaves a positive mark." He showed Elias his crude sketches, his eyes alight with an unfamiliar fire. Elias listened patiently, a faint smile playing on his lips. "So the seed has finally sprouted," he mused. "It's a noble vision, Arthur. But visions are fragile things. They need roots, and they need nourishment. What will be your foundation this time?" Arthur paused, considering. "Integrity," he said firmly, "and empathy. I want to understand the needs of the communities I serve, not just dictate to them. I want to build with purpose, not just for profit." "And how will you do that, with no capital, no reputation, and a past that precedes you?" Elias challenged gently. Arthur's enthusiasm faltered for a moment, the harsh reality of his situation pressing in. "I don't know yet," he admitted, his shoulders slumping slightly. "But I have to try. I can't go back to being the man I was. And I can't stay where I am." Elias nodded, his gaze unwavering. "That, Arthur, is the beginning of true purpose, when the why becomes stronger than the how." Arthur left the diner that night with a renewed sense of direction. The path was still unclear, fraught with obstacles, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a genuine sense of hope. He wasn't just surviving, he was envisioning a future where his skills and experience could be used for something greater than personal gain. The vision was still raw, unformed, but it was his, and it was rooted in a profound shift in his understanding of what it meant to truly succeed. He had found a deeper purpose, one that transcended the fleeting allure of money and power, promising a different kind of wealth altogether. Arthur's new vision, though powerful, remained an abstract dream without resources. He continued working at Maria's coffee shop, saving every dollar, learning the value of honest labor. He spent his evenings meticulously refining his plans for community-focused, sustainable housing, poring over architectural sketches and financial models. He knew he needed capital, but the thought of approaching old contacts, or even new investors, filled him with dread. His past still loomed large, a scarlet letter on his professional reputation. Then, an unexpected opportunity arose. Maria, impressed by Arthur's dedication and surprisingly keen business insights, mentioned a local grant program for small businesses focused on community development. It was a long shot, requiring a detailed proposal and a public presentation to a panel of local philanthropists and city officials. The prize was modest compared to his former deals, but it was enough to kickstart his first project, a small, affordable housing complex for low-income families in a neglected part of Brooklyn. As Arthur prepared his presentation, he poured his heart into it, articulating not just the financial viability, but the social impact. He spoke of dignity, of community, of building homes, not just houses. The day of the presentation arrived, and Arthur, dressed in his best and only suit, felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, but this time, it was mixed with genuine purpose, not just avarice. He walked into the room, and his eyes immediately fell upon one of the panelists, Mr. Harrison, a notoriously tough and influential real estate magnate, and a man Arthur had once outmaneuvered in a particularly cutthroat deal, leaving Harrison's company with significant losses. Mr. Harrison's gaze was cold, unyielding. He remembered Arthur, and the animosity was palpable. During the Q&A, Harrison's questions were sharp, probing, designed to expose any weakness, any hint of Arthur's old, ruthless self. "Mr. Sterling," Harrison began, his voice dripping with skepticism, "your past suggests a man driven purely by profit. What assurance do we have that this new vision isn't just a convenient facade to regain your footing? How can we trust that you won't revert to your old ways once capital is secured?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Arthur. This was the test. Arthur could have defended himself, pointed fingers, or tried to charm his way out. But he chose a different path. He looked directly at Harrison, his voice steady, devoid of his former arrogance. "Mr. Harrison, you are right to be skeptical. My past actions were driven by a singular, often selfish, pursuit of wealth. I caused harm, and I regret that deeply. I cannot offer you assurances based on my past. I can only offer you my present commitment, a commitment born from losing everything, from understanding the true cost of unchecked ambition. This project isn't about my profit, it's about proving that I can build something with integrity, something that genuinely serves others. If you choose not to believe me, I understand. But I ask you to believe in the project, in the families who desperately need these homes. My past is a part of me, but it does not define who I am striving to become." The honesty in his voice, the raw vulnerability, was disarming. Harrison stared at him for a long moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. The moral choice was clear: embrace his past mistakes, or try to hide them. Arthur chose truth, and in that moment, he truly began his rebirth. The silence that followed Arthur's confession to Mr. Harrison was deafening, stretching for what felt like an eternity. Then, a quiet murmur rippled through the room. The panel, initially swayed by Harrison's pointed questions, seemed to shift. Harrison himself, after a long, scrutinizing stare, simply nodded, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. The grant was awarded to Arthur's project. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a lifeline, a validation that his new path was not only possible but recognized. With the grant secured, Arthur plunged into his new venture, which he named Phoenix Homes. The name was deliberate, a constant reminder of his own rebirth. He rented a small, unassuming office in Brooklyn, a far cry from his former opulent headquarters. His team was small but dedicated. A young architect passionate about sustainable design, a community organizer with deep roots in the neighborhood, and a former construction foreman who believed in Arthur's vision. He hired local workers, many of whom had been overlooked by larger developers, providing them with fair wages and training. Every decision was filtered through his newfound principles of integrity and empathy. He spent countless hours on site, not just overseeing construction, but talking to the future residents, understanding their needs, incorporating their feedback into the designs. He remembered Elias's words, "What will you build now? And for whom? This time, he was building for the community, for families who deserved safe, affordable, and beautiful homes. He faced numerous challenges: unexpected material delays, bureaucratic red tape, and the lingering skepticism of some who remembered his past. But Arthur met each obstacle with a quiet determination, drawing on the resilience he had forged in the crucible of his own downfall. One afternoon, as he reviewed blueprints with his architect, Maria, his former boss from the coffee shop, walked into his office. She held a small, potted plant. "Heard you got the grant, Arthur," she said, a rare smile gracing her lips. "And that you're building something good." She placed the plant on his desk. A little something to green up the place, and a reminder that even small things can grow into something beautiful. Her visit was a quiet affirmation, a testament to the genuine connections he was now forming. Phoenix Homes wasn't just constructing buildings, it was building trust, one brick, one conversation, one honest decision at a time. Arthur wasn't chasing headlines or stock prices. He was chasing impact. He learned to negotiate with suppliers not just for the best price, but for ethical sourcing. He collaborated with local schools to create apprenticeship programs. He was no longer the lone wolf, but a part of a larger ecosystem, contributing to its health and vitality. The work was harder, the financial rewards slower, but the satisfaction was deeper, more profound than any deal he had ever closed in his previous life. He was rebuilding, not just his life, but his soul, brick by empathetic brick. Years passed. Phoenix Homes flourished, not into a sprawling empire like Arthur's first venture, but into a respected and sustainable enterprise. They built dozens of affordable housing units, community centers, and even revitalized a neglected urban park. Arthur, now older, with silver at his temples and a permanent, gentle crinkle around his eyes, was a different man entirely. He still possessed the sharp intellect and strategic mind that had once made him a millionaire, but these qualities were now tempered by humility, compassion, and a profound understanding of human connection. He no longer wore bespoke suits, preferring comfortable, practical attire. His days were spent between construction sites, community meetings, and mentoring young entrepreneurs who sought his advice, not for financial gain, but for guidance on building businesses with a conscience. He had reconnected with his children, not through lavish gifts, but through shared experiences and honest conversations about his past and his new purpose. They saw a father who was flawed, yes, but also one who had found redemption, a man who had learned to truly live. One sunny afternoon, Arthur sat on a bench in the revitalized urban park, watching children play on equipment Phoenix Homes had helped install. Elias, now frielier but with the same perceptive eyes, sat beside him. "You found it, didn't you, Arthur?" Elias said, his voice soft. "The true wealth." Arthur smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "Yes, Elias, I did. It wasn't in the balance sheets or the market cap. It was in the faces of those families moving into their new homes. It was in the laughter of these children. It was in the trust one earned back, one small, honest step at a time." He paused, reflecting. "I used to measure success in dollars, in power. I thought that was the pinnacle. But it was an empty pursuit. The real success, the true wealth, is in impact. In knowing that your work makes a tangible difference in someone's life. In the peace that comes from living a life aligned with your values." He remembered the crushing weight of his fall, the isolation, the despair. It had been a brutal, agonizing journey. But without that profound loss, he would never have found this deeper, more meaningful existence. Failure, Arthur mused, looking out at the vibrant park. It wasn't the end. It was the foundation. It stripped away everything false, everything superficial, and left me with the raw materials to build something real, something lasting. He turned to Elias. "Thank you, old friend, for challenging me, for seeing something in me I couldn't see myself." Elias simply nodded, his eyes twinkling. "We all fall, Arthur. The measure of a man isn't how hard he falls, but how high he bounces back." And more importantly, what he chooses to build with the pieces. Arthur looked at his hands, once accustomed to signing multi-million-dollar deals, now calloused from honest work. He had lost an empire, but he had gained a soul. He had traded fleeting riches for enduring purpose, and in doing so, he had discovered a wealth far beyond anything money could buy, a wealth measured in redemption, resilience, and the quiet, profound joy of a life truly lived. His story was a testament that even from the ashes of ruin, one could rise, not just to rebuild, but to become something infinitely more valuable than before.